Hello, thank you all for coming this evening. Welcome to our Green Thumb Thursdays program at Morrisson-Reeves Library. My name is Beth Herrick, and we're just very happy to have you here for this part of the series. And we do have a few upcoming programs as well, and they're not all filled up yet. So if you want to join up for one of the next ones, you've got a flyer on your table, and I'll tag that information for our virtual participants as well. Unfortunately, we're not able to be live tonight, but I will upload this to YouTube. Facebook is having some access challenges this evening, so who knew? But we're very grateful to have local expert with us, Jonathan Ferris. Jonathan is the Wayne County, Purdue Extension Director for Wayne County Extension. And we're very happy to have his expertise in teaching us all we need to know about dealing with pests and diseases for our plants that we're trying to grow. It is maddening when you get aphids, it's maddening when you get root rot, it's maddening when you get these problems, and so there's not a magic wand, but there are tools and tips from the experts that we can take and use into our daily practice. I'll let Jonathan introduce himself more fully with whatever you'd like, and we're just very grateful for your expertise. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, first of all, how's the microphone sound? Not good? Maybe it's the mask.
A little reverberation.
So if she could turn it down just a smidge. See, my volume is normally pretty loud, so people can...
Yeah, see, that's worse. How's
So we'll
this?
try this again. How does it sound now? Any better?
I don't know. Yeah, it's not great tonight, is it?
Would it be better without it?
Yeah.
It
Think
might.
so?
It might.
Okay, let's try it without it.
I'll grab that. Just make sure they can hear you.
How's that? Can you hear me? Okay. I have a pretty good volume anyway, but I've got this mask on, and so it kind of muffles me in a little bit, but I am glad to be here tonight. I love it when I see people who are wanting to learn things. I love to learn. I'm an adult learner. I've been learning my whole life, and so I appreciate people that take time out of their busy schedules to come and learn about something. So kudos to all of you for participating in this program, and thanks to Beth for putting this on for us. So just a little bit about my background. Beth asked me earlier how long I've been with Purdue, and actually, as it turns out, this is my anniversary month. I will complete 24 years at the end of the month. So I'll be starting my 25th year with Purdue Extension. I've only been in Wayne County though for about 8 of those years. I started up in Jay County, Indiana, moved to Henry County and Fayette County, but Wayne County is where I was born and raised. I'm a Cambridge City, Milton boy. So I was glad to have an opportunity to come back home and take a position in Wayne County 8 years ago. So my background a little bit is just, I went to Huntington College. Anybody know where Huntington College is? Small school up in northern Indiana, and majored in biology. And then from there, I went to Michigan State University and studied fish and wildlife management. So you look at this title tonight and think, what in the world is he doing talking about this subject with the fisheries and wildlife degree? I thought I was going to be a fisheries biologist out in the wilds of Michigan somewhere, but that's not what fate had for me. So when you do this line of work in Purdue Extension, especially when you have the Ag and Natural Resources title, which is what I have, I'm an extension educator for Ag and Natural Resources, you get to look at a lot of sick plants, and you get to look at a lot of bugs. And I guess I should ask, just out of curiosity, how many of you knew that there was a Purdue Extension office in Wayne County? A couple of you knew that, okay, but not everybody. There is a Purdue Extension office in every county of the state. And that's not true of some of the other land grant systems. Like Michigan State does not have an extension office in every county anymore. Illinois, I think, went away from that a couple years back. So we're very fortunate, we think, in Indiana that we have a Purdue presence in every county, because that way, when you call me and say, hey, I've got something going on in my yard or in my garden, or I've got a tree that looks sick, I can come out and look at it, and I can help you figure out what's going on. We can solve those problems. So Many of the photographs that you're going to see tonight are pictures that I took here in Wayne County of common diseases and pests. We've got about an hour tonight, so there's no way that I'm going to cover everything you possibly want to know. What I decided to do was just pick some common diseases and common problems that I see with trees and vegetables and that kind of thing. So we're going to work through this. But since I have these pictures up there, can you guys see these little white things all crusted all over this juniper? It's really magnified, but that's a juniper needles, okay? And those things are juniper scales. A lot of people don't look close at their plants and realize oftentimes we have these insects called scales that attach themselves. But the reason I got called to come look at that was the whole juniper bush was turning brown, looking kind of bronze in color. And you have to really look close to see those juniper scales. So that's an example of one of the odd ones that we get, these scales. And they go after things like euonymus, junipers, and a lot of other things. Then over here we have I think that was either a cucumber or a melon of some type. But what's going on with that leaf? Well, it's desiccating, right? It's dying back. But it's in a very specific pattern. If you look, the leaf veins are still green, but in between the leaf veins is where it's turning brown. And that's something called anthracnose. It's a fungal infection, and we'll talk more about fungal infections in a little bit. So I always start with this picture, though. Why don't all our landscapes and gardens look like that? That's what we all want, right? It's because, now I suppose if you were to look close in there, you'd probably find some weeds, you might find some insects and some disease damage and that kind of thing, but that's what we're all after, right? Something that looks like that. But we don't ever get there. That's because of these things, right? We have physiological problems with our plants. We have infectious diseases, fungal, bacterial, viral, insects, wildlife damage. We even have things called, what we call an extension, John Deere blight. And that means when your husband gets too close to the trees with his John Deere mower and scars them up and tears the bark off, that's John Deere blight. But since I mentioned viral up there, I'll share an example of kind of what it is that we do in extension. On Tuesday of this week, I had an opportunity to travel around the county with two Purdue Extension specialists from West Lafayette. One was a PhD in plant pathology or plant diseases. The other one was a PhD in entomology, so the study of insects. And we had both of them come out because we have some greenhouses in the county that are experiencing some problems with diseases on vegetables and flowering plants. And turns out this disease is spread by a little thing called a thrip. And there's a very specific type of thrip that spreads this infection. And it was big enough news because it's not real common in Indiana that they decided to come out and go around with these. So we spent the day driving around the county from greenhouse to greenhouse looking for these thrips and for the infection that they spread. So that's an example of what Extension does. Is we are an extension of the university. And we bring people out, expertise from West Lafayette, to come out to the county to help solve problems. So we're going to go through each of these physiological things, environmental, in other words, things that are not biological, as opposed to diseases like fungal diseases, bacterial, viral, and then of course insects and wildlife. Does anybody know what causes this, or know what that's called? On a tomato, yes?
Blossom end rot?
Blossom end rot. Now, very good. The name itself implies that it's some type of an infectious disease, right? It says blossom end rot. Turns out it's not an infectious disease. It's not caused by a bacteria or a virus or any kind of a pathogen. It's caused by an imbalance of water in the plant, and that causes an interference in the plant's ability to take up calcium from the soil. And that causes the fruit to get that rotted look to it. And tomatoes aren't the only plant that can get that. I've seen peppers that'll do the same thing. But that's a result of somebody soaking the tomato plants, then letting them get dry, then soaking them again, letting them get dry, so you get this wild fluctuation in soil moisture. So on these plants, we strive to get even soil moisture. So we like to use mulch to keep the water there longer so it doesn't evaporate quite as quickly, and things like that. So that's an example of a physiological problem that's not infectious. But it's hard to convince a lot of homeowners of that when they come in to look at their tomatoes, and they're all looking like that. I have to explain there's nothing to be sprayed. You can't spray for it to cure it. It's just one of those things. So let's look at some more physiological problems. Many of the problems that we see, not only in vegetable gardens, but with backyard trees and shrubs, are moisture issues. And it could be too much or not enough. One of the classic scenarios I remember was years ago when I was in Fayette County. I got called to look at a shrub in somebody's landscape. And they said that the shrub just wasn't doing well. It seemed to be wilting and kind of dying back. And I pulled up to the front yard and got out and looked, and I could tell from the road what the problem was. There was a downspout from the house that came out right at the base of where that shrub was. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on there. It's getting drowned by this excess water from the downspout. So what's tricky is the symptoms that too much moisture or not enough moisture cause can look very similar.
The same, yeah.
So it's hard to diagnose. For example, on Colorado blue spruce, we have a lot of problems with Colorado blue spruce. I could spend an hour tonight just talking about the problems with Colorado blue spruce. If you're thinking about planting an evergreen, please do not plant a Colorado blue spruce because they just get a lot of problems. The Colorado blue spruce, if they're in a low area that gets too much water, they'll start to wilt and die back. If they get dry, they're going to wilt and die back from the top down. So the symptoms look very similar. So you have to know something about that site and about the history of rainfall patterns, and does it pond or flood there, and things like that. Poor soil is an issue. I've worked with a lot of homeowners, and it seems to be especially new homeowners that just built a new house, and they had a lot of earthwork done around the house, and a lot of smoothing of the dirt, and excavation of a basement, and things like that, excavation of a driveway maybe, septic systems, all these kind of things. And so what ended up on the top was not topsoil. It was subsoil that ended up on the surface, and that can cause a lot of problems. So one of the services that we offer through our office is soil testing. If you ever wanted to have your soil tested, you can bring it to our office. We ask you bring in about 1 pound of soil. And it turns out that's about, if you think about what a small coffee can is, that's about 1 pound of soil. It needs to be good dry soil, so don't do it when it's wet. A couple weeks ago, somebody brought me a big clod of mud. It was sitting on my desk when I got back to the office one day. I was like, oh my goodness. So I literally took a hammer, because once it dried out, it was like a rock, and hammered and beat it and pulverized it so I could get it in the soil bag. But bring us about 1 pound of soil. It costs $15 for a sample. We mail it off to the lab for you, and then when we get the results back, I either email them to you if you provide me with an email, or I can call you, and we can talk through it and explain what the recommendations are, what it means, look at your pH levels, all that kind of thing. So that's a service that we offer. Too much or not enough sun, same thing as moisture, can cause very similar symptoms. Kind of the classic example is a hosta that's planted in the sun, or that gets too much sun. It starts to get sun scald, it gets burn injury, and just doesn't look healthy. Okay, that's an example. What about herbicide drift? I get called out probably 3 or 4 times a year, and this is about the time of the year when it starts, to go look at people's garden plants, and when they think that the neighboring farmer has sprayed something that's blown over onto their vegetables or their grape arbor or whatever it is that they're trying to grow, peach trees, and look for signs of herbicide drift. So let me just give you a quick lesson on what you look for, okay? One of the things we look for, this is an example of herbicide drift, okay? You see all the little tan spots? Okay? That could be a fungal infection. It looks very similar to what we would expect to see from a fungal infection. But it turns out in this case, it was herbicide driven. It was little tiny droplets of herbicide, plant killer, that landed on the leaf. And this herbicide was what we call a bleacher type mode of action. It interferes, with the chlorophyll production in the leaf. So it turns those spots tan. And of course, if I was trying to kill that plant, I would spray the whole leaf with it, and it would interfere with the chlorophyll. That would starve the plant and kill it, right? If it was a weed. But in this case, it was a herbicide drip situation. I want to point out the difference here. This is a fungal infection. And what I want to point out is you've got these brown lesions, but you notice how they have kind of a yellow halo around them, and they seem to be growing together or spreading. You see how it's kind of turning yellow in the middle here and growing together? That's a real good example of a fungal infection. So that just shows you the differences and some of the challenges with diagnosing problems. And I'll talk more about our plant and pest disease lab, but that's another service that we offer, is we can collect samples from your garden or your trees or your yard or whatever, and send it into our plant and pest diagnostic lab, and they will analyze it for fungal infection, viral infection, all that kind of thing. And it's $11 for Indiana residents, so it's a very reasonable fee. Really probably the most of the expense is just shipping it there, because we encourage you to overnight the sample to get it there quickly so it's fresh so they can look at it. So anyway, a couple of things about physiological problems. What about this one? Now this is a strange one, I think. I remember when I learned this years ago, I was like, that's really bizarre. But one of the things that I ask people, when somebody calls me and says they have a vegetable garden, and a lot of the plants are wilting at the same time, and kind of looking like they're out of water, they start to shrivel up. Especially if it's a new vegetable garden, one of the first questions I ask is, do you have any walnut trees nearby? Does anybody know what the problem is with walnut trees? Walnut trees release a toxin in their root system called juglone. And it's toxic to many vegetable plants. And the issue is, most people think that a tree root system is a mirror image of what's up above ground. But that's really not the case. Trees' root systems really look like that. So they can go out 2 to 3 times the height of the tree sideways. So if you have a vegetable garden over here, you're growing in amongst those tree roots, and those tree roots could be releasing that juglone and causing problems. And I've seen that more times than you might think, where people are growing vegetable gardens near walnut trees. So just something to think about there. Okay, let's look at some diseases. We're going to start with fungal diseases. So we'll talk about blights on tomato. That's a real common one. Early blight, late blight. I think there's a mid blight. Those are true fungal infections. And if you've ever grown tomatoes, you know how maddening that is when the whole plant suddenly curls up and just withers. And you can spray whatever you want at that point, and it's not going to do anything for it. And I'll explain why in a second. Here's that anthracnose picture again. Interestingly enough, this is anthracnose on green beans. How many of you have ever had green beans that look like that? I remember growing up, our green beans, when we were snapping beans, those are the parts that got thrown away, right? Was the ones that had those spots on them. That's the same fungus that causes that, causes this on green beans. And here's your blights. On the tomatoes, you see all the leaves turning brown and withering and falling off. On pumpkins, it's very similar. You get fungal diseases like downy mildew or powdery mildew that turns the leaves white, interferes with the chlorophyll production, causes them to desiccate and die back. So the thing that I guess I want to leave you with as far as fungal infections is, most of the time, if you have an infection on, let's say, tomatoes, it's not going to go from the tomatoes to your green beans or to your squash. most of the fungal infections we have are very species specific. The same thing is true in your backyard trees and your shrubs and those kind of things. If you have an infection on your Colorado blue spruce, it's not going to go to your maple tree or your oak tree. They're very specific fungal strains. Now, I said that anthracnose is the same thing. It's actually a little bit different strain. It's still called anthracnose. So that's a point that I like to make with homeowners when they see something going on with a tree in their backyard or a plant in their vegetable garden. I'd like to express that, it's not going to probably spread to other things. It's very specific. And a good example is this downy mildew of pumpkins. Okay, there's other downy mildews that will go after cucumbers and things like that. So there's plenty of diseases to go around, but they're all different. Okay.
How do you get rid of that?
Yeah. So we're jumping ahead a little bit, but since you asked the question, I'll go ahead and talk about it. The key to fungal management is two things. One is moisture management. Okay, so for example, tomato blights. A lot of the tomato blights need moisture, and they really like moisture on the leaves. So anything you can do to keep water off of the leaves and off of the stems will help. So what I don't like to see is people going along with a hose and a sprayer and watering them over the top like that, because it's just putting moisture on the leaves that then can lead to fungal infection. So the better way to do it is to get a watering can and water at the base of the plant. And also put mulch around the plant so that the fungal spores that are in the ground don't get splashed up by rain. If you've ever seen your vegetable garden after a hard rain, there'll be soil splashed up on the lower 6 or 8 inches of a lot of those plants just from the raindrops beating down. So putting mulch around them will help. So managing moisture is a strategy. The other strategy is a fungicide. But the problem with our fungicide sprays is all the fungicides that you and I can go to the hardware store and buy are preventative in nature, not curative in nature. So they prevent infection, but they don't cure it once it's started. The problem with that is most of the time we don't go out and start spraying until we notice, hey, my pumpkin leaves are turning white. I think I better spray something on them. Well, by the time you see it, it's already too late. Because how these things work is they create a barrier on the leaf tissue. So when that fungal spore lands on the leaf, and I don't know if you know how spores work, but they actually germinate like a seed does, and they have this little projection that goes down into the leaf tissue. You're trying to create a physical chemical barrier on that leaf tissue so that when that spore germinates, it'll kill that spore. But if the spore lands and gets inside and infects the leaf, now the infection has already started, and all the fungicide sprays in the world won't stop it. So fungus can be really tricky. That's why it's important to look for resistant varieties, manage moisture, keep the soil off the plants, all those kind of things can really help. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about lawn diseases. I love looking at lawns. I've already looked at a lot of lawns this spring already as things start to green up. But we have a lot of fungal infections in our lawns every year. And if you were to ever go out and just pull up a clump of grass in your yard and look at it closely, you would probably see some fungal infection. Okay? So there's a lot of fungus out there that we just don't notice and we just tolerate it. And our grass generally does a pretty good job of outgrowing it and dealing with it. But from time to time, it can get bad enough that we start to notice dead patches or dead circles or spots. And it's really obvious when you look at like golf courses and places that are really closely mowed, you'll start to see funny things out there. So on a golf course, it's a real problem because they have to manage that intensively. So let's go through these pictures. You see this grass blade? You see this tan lesion? If you use your imagination, it looks kind of like an hourglass. Okay, it kind of narrows in the middle.
Yeah, it does.
And then it's got this kind of tan or kind of a brownish margin on the edge of the lesion there. That's what we call a dollar spot. And if you were to let that go, and if it was closely mowed turf, like bent grass or something, it would form about a silver dollar sized circle, a little dead patch, and you would have these little spots everywhere. On grass that is allowed to grow taller, it doesn't quite look like that. It just looks like individual lesions. You see there's another lesion starting there on an individual leaf blade. But you see what's happening? That leaf blade is growing out all the while. So we don't usually worry about fungicides on home lawns. I have a gentleman north of Cambridge City that I've dealt with a couple times over the years, and he does have some fungal problems in his yard. He gets this stuff every year. It's rust. And that's real common too. When you go out in the yard, let's say in late September, when the grass really isn't growing very much and there's a lot of dew out every morning, and you walk through the yard and your shoes turn orange. Have you ever seen that? That's rust, and that's a fungus. And if you look close at this leaf blade, you see these little tiny orange dots growing all over it. Okay, that's rust. But there again, it's really common. It doesn't kill the grass. It just looks unsightly for a while. So aesthetically, it's not very pleasant to look out at your orange yard in September. But your grass will grow out of it and probably be just fine. Does anybody know what this is called? See that green ring?
Alien?
Yeah, I think the aliens were there.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. And the name for it is about as silly as that. It's called a fairy ring.
Oh, yeah.
That's a fungus. And what's happening is the fungus is growing in the middle of that circle and spreading under the ground. And at the margin of the fungus, it's releasing nitrogen. So you get this intense green ring around the edge of it. So the fungus is that big. In fact, fungi are some of the largest living creatures in the world. Some of them are. They can grow in the rainforest jungles and take up acres of space underground. So it's kind of interesting. But the bottom line takeaway message of fungal diseases in the lawn is we don't very often recommend spraying for them. What we encourage you to do, for example, with rust in the late summer, is go ahead and fertilize your yard once the rains return, because kind of a typical late summer pattern is it tends to get really dry in late August and September. When the rains start to come back, go ahead and fertilize your yard in the fall, and that'll get that grass growing again, and it helps it to outgrow that rust fungus. Okay? Let's talk about some tree issues. Okay? I think all these are Wayne County pictures. I made the note here that trees are hard to diagnose sometimes. What do you notice going on here? That guy had staked his little maple tree and tied a nylon twine around it and left it that way for years. And as the tree grew, the nylon twine literally dug into it and girdled it and killed the tree. One of my favorite stories with that is when I worked in Fayette County. There was a city building downtown, and outside of it they had these big shrubs, these yews shrubs. And they called me one day and said, "We need to come look at these shrubs. They're dying back. The branches are dying." I went and looked at it. It was a really weird pattern. I thought, this doesn't make sense to me. What's going on? So I actually got behind it and got in there and started digging around a little bit, and noticed they had Christmas lights wrapped around the branches that had been left there for years, and they had girdled individual branches that were now dying back. So sometimes it's easy to diagnose, but many times it's not. And the example I like to use is blue spruce. That's not a very good specimen of a blue spruce. It doesn't have that dark, rich blue color that we like. But you see what's happening. It's thinning from the bottom, right, working its way up. Does anybody have a tree that's doing that, or have seen a tree that does that?
Yeah.
So there's a couple things that will cause that. I'm gonna say more than half of the time, probably 75% of the time if I was counting, it's one of the needle cast fungal infections. And it's called a needle cast because they literally cast the needles off. They get rid of them when they're infected. This is a healthy needle. So we took a needle off the tree, looked at it under the microscope, and that's what a healthy needle looks like. It's green. It's got little pores up and down the length of the needle. But what do you notice on this needle? Well, first of all, the color's a little different, right? It's turning brown. But you see all the little dark specks coming out of these pores? Those are it's the fungal fruiting bodies, or the fungal seed producers, if you will, that are coming out of those little pores in the needle itself. So that's a visual sign of a fungal infection. And there's 3 or 4 of them that will affect blue spruce. There's one called Rhizosphaera, there's one called Dothostroma, and one called Stigmina, are the 3 that I'm familiar with. But they all cause this kind of a pattern of dying back from the bottom up. Why does it start at the bottom and work its way up? Well, where is the most moisture on this tree? Is it at the very tippy top, or is it down here close to the ground? It's close to the ground, right? After a rain, the bottom part of the tree stays wet longer than the top part of it does. So the fungal infections will usually start from the bottom and work their way up. If you have a spruce tree or a pine that's doing that, that's dying from the bottom up, oftentimes that's a sign of a fungal infection. If it's dying from the top down, that's a sign of a root issue going on underground. And those are the ones that are really tough to diagnose because you can't always see the roots. The exception is this guy right here. Now, what do you notice going on at the base of that tree? How are the roots growing?
They're girdling the tree.
They're girdling the tree, and these are literally called girdling roots. Now, the problem is that tree was planted improperly. And it was probably planted improperly 25 years back. Okay, that's a pretty old tree. But it was planted improperly. And oftentimes what we see in many tree problems that I look at go back to how they were planted and cared for in those first couple of years following planting. So if you want to know more about planting trees, Purdue Extension has a really good bulletin on planting trees. So I don't have the number on the top of my head, but if you Google Purdue Extension tree planting, or call me at the office, and I'll give you my office number. It's of course 765-973-9281. We're out at the Kuhlman Center at the fairgrounds, if you know where that is, where the big COVID vaccination center is going on right now. That's where our office is. So yeah, this is a great picture because this is one of the rare occasions where you can actually see the roots growing around. So probably what happened was, when that tree was planted, they dug a hole the size of the root ball, plunked it in there, and called it good. Right? So as those roots tried to grow out, they hit that hard sidewall and they started growing around. And they kept growing around until they literally circled the tree, and after 20 some years, 30 years, girdled it and killed it. Now it's hard to convince a homeowner that that's what's going on, but oftentimes that is what happens. It's just not always as obvious and evident and visible as it is there. One other thing to look for when we're talking about planting trees is your tree, when it comes to the ground, should flare out. And you see there is a root flare here. It kind of flares out at the base. If your tree looks like a telephone pole going in the ground, that's a bad sign. That means it was planted too deeply. And then you can get those roots growing around the base of the tree and killing it there too. So like I said, I do another hour on planting trees sometime if you want to do that. But let's look at this guy here. This is in the southwest side of Richmond. I remember where this was. I can't tell you the road, but I remember where it was. It's a maple tree, and it's a little hard to tell what's going on, but what's happening is individual branches on this tree are dying back all the way to the trunk. The whole branch is just dying back right to the trunk. That is something called verticillium wilt, and I couldn't diagnose it from just looking at it. I had my suspicions that's what was going on because of the way that the branches were dying back. But I had to take a sample, and we sent it to the Purdue Plant and Pest Lab, and they came back, it was positive for verticillium wilt. Verticillium is a naturally found bacteria in the soil. And it affects trees like maples and redbuds probably most commonly. I think there's some other ones, but maples and redbuds are the two that I'm familiar with. And that's what it does. It causes this dying back of the branches, because what happens is that tree recognizes that it's sick and tries to prevent the spread of the disease by creating this thick sac, and it literally plugs up the vascular bundles in that tree's branches and chokes the branches off. And the whole branches will die back. That tree's gonna die. There's no spray, there's no treatment. What we recommend if you have verticillium like that is to remove that tree and replace it with something that's not a maple or a redbud. That's about the only thing you can really do. Okay? So, a little bit about trees. I'm gonna move along because we got just a little bit of time here to cover the rest of it. We've talked about this a little bit when you were asking about how you deal with fungal diseases. When we talk about managing diseases, and I don't care if it's a vegetable disease or a lawn disease or a tree disease, we talk about this plant disease, this three-legged stool. What we're trying to do is break off one of the legs of the stool, because you have to have all three legs or all three sides of this triangle. The another way to think of it is a triangle. And you're trying to break that. There's three things that you have to have. You have to have a susceptible host, you gotta have a favorable environment, and you have to have a virulent pathogen. What does that mean? That means it has to be alive and active. Okay, there are some diseases that kind of lay dormant until the environment conditions are just right, like wet leaves on your tomato plants. If the leaves aren't wet, they're not going to get infected. But once they're wet, there's enough moisture there, then they can get infected. So you have to have a virulent pathogen, a favorable environment, and a susceptible host. I told you about the greenhouses that we visited on Tuesday. One of the strategies we're working with the growers is to try to find a resistant variety, because there are resistant varieties to this disease out there. And we asked the growers, why? Because they're all growing the same tomato. It's called a red deuce. And the problem with red deuce, well, not the problem is, the issue with red deuce is that's what consumers like. When you go to the grocery store, it's that big, plump, red tomato that's nice and juicy and good for sandwiches and good for pastas and all those kind of things. Has a lot of good qualities to it, but it's susceptible to this disease. So there are other varieties that are not susceptible or less susceptible. So if you can pick resistant varieties, whether that be maples that are resistant to verticillium wilt, or tomatoes that are resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus, whatever it is, look for varieties that are resistant. And you say, well, what does that mean? Like, when you go to the store and you're picking out vegetable plants to start with, you pull the little seed tag out and it tells you what it is, the variety name and all that. There will be letters next to the name, like VSFN, and that'll stand for things like verticillium wilt, fusarium wilt, nematodes, various diseases and insect pests. So try to get as many letters as you can on your seed tag or on your plant label, and that will help you. The other thing here, we talked about this a little bit, is water management, planting at the right time, water early in the morning so that it's not don't water late at night, late in the evening so that the moisture stays on the plant. Water early in the morning so that the sun can help dry it up so they're not wet. I used to work on a golf course, and one of the things we did at the golf course was you can't water the greens during the day, right? Because the golfers are out there and they don't like to get wet. So you water at night, and you can't water them all at one time. So you start on this green, it goes for half an hour, this green gets a half an hour, and you work your way around the golf course watering everything. And that's a perfect environment for fungal development. And that's why golf courses have so many problems with diseases. Anyway, side note. As far as the virulent pathogens, some things that you can try are good sanitation, rotate your crops, buy healthy plants. You know, if you beware of the cheapy sales that go on like at Walmart and places like that. Well, we've got this special deal today, you know, flats are half off. It could be because there's a problem with them, right? So make sure that you look at them, pull the plants out, look at the roots, make sure the roots look white and firm and healthy, okay? Let's talk about insects real quick. Just a little notes here of some things that are very rarely affected by insects, and then some things that are almost always affected. And I don't think that's going to be a surprise to many of you when you see that, right? Things like broccoli, cabbage, cantaloupe, cucumber, eggplant. One of my favorite garden pests. Anybody know what this is called? What is it?
Potato beetle.
Potato beetle. Colorado potato beetle. Real nasty critter. Okay, they can devastate your garden. So I'm not going to go into a lot about that, but just so you recognize that's what they are. Okay, so just know that if you're planting these things, okay, you're probably going to have insect pests to deal with. So what do? Well, sometimes the best thing is just to do nothing. And what I mean by that is insects have a hard life. There's a lot of things that are eating them. They're kind of the base of the food chain, right? Everything eats bugs. So sometimes you can let them go and let nature take its course and take its toll on them. Things like adverse weather, you know, the rainfall can reduce insect numbers, especially things like mites and thrips. The problem with those greenhouses that we went to is they were raising them indoors. So that they never got a good heavy rain on them to wash the insects off. So they had spider mites and they had these thrips all over them. Okay? Insects are attacked, of course, by a variety of predators, parasites, and diseases. Let's do a quick survey here. Anybody know what this guy is? These are the good guys in the vegetable garden. Okay, these are the ones that we want to see, because if you see those are voracious predators of a lot of things that we don't like. So what's this one? Anybody know? That's a lacewing. You see how it's got this lacy pattern to the wing? Okay. The interesting thing is this guy up here, and if you can tell, it's eating an aphid, or some type of little fly, it's eating it. That's a lacewing larva. So lacewings are good both in the larval stage and in the adult stage. They're voracious predators of small insects. What about this guy? You probably ought to recognize him. Yeah, it's a lady beetle, right? Did you know this is also a lady beetle? That's the lady beetle larva. And both of them are voracious predators on things like thrips, aphids, mites, a lot of small insects. Then we get up in size a little bit here. We deal with these guys. This is a ground beetle. There's hundreds of species of ground beetles, but they all have these big pictures on them. And they eat bigger things like caterpillars. They like to eat soft, succulent-bodied insects. How many of you have these guys in your homes right now?
Oh, yeah.
I've got them. Okay, they're a real pest, aren't they? They crawl up the windows, and if you handle them and try to throw them outside, they make your hands stink sometimes. Those are stink bugs, and the ones that are getting in our houses right now are the brown marmorated stink bugs. They're a fairly new invasive pest we've only had for a few years. But outdoors, they do us a good service. They eat a lot of, this guy's piercing a little caterpillar of some type with his mouth part there and working for us. The problem is they don't stay outside. They tend to get in our homes and cause us problems. What about this one? This is a really teeny tiny one. Maybe a quarter of an inch, if that, long. If you've ever been mowing in the summer and you get sweat in the back of your neck and all of a sudden you get this, ouch, something got you in the back of the neck, it could be this guy. They tend to like sweat areas, so they'll land on the back of your neck when you're mowing. That's what I get them. And they bite. They've got a real piercing mouth part. It looks like a little needle. You see here it's piercing, looks like an aphid egg. So that tells you how small that is. Really teeny tiny stuff. But they're voracious predators. And the last one is a little hard to see, this one. But he's one of my favorites because it's about this big. Anybody ever seen that guy with the little spikes? It's got this ray of spikes sticking up out of its back. Right here. It looks like spokes of a wheel.
Oh, yeah.
So it's called
I
a
totally
wheel
get
bug.
Yeah.
Or an assassin bug.
Assassin.
And they got this long folding mouth part that folds out like a needle, and they jab it in other insects and suck the juice out of them and eat them. So these are all good guys. We found some of these. We found some lacewings in some of the greenhouses that we were at, and some of the growers were actually releasing predatory thrips and predatory mites that are good guys. There's a whole bunch of them out there. These are just some of the common ones that we see here. Parasites, here's an example of well, let me ask, you know what this insect is called?
Caterpillar?
Yeah, it's a caterpillar, but it's
Oh, the evil hornworm.
tomato hornworm. Yeah, tomato hornworm. What in the world is growing out of that thing all over it?
Something's eating.
Those are parasites that have laid their eggs. It's really kind of gross, right? They've laid their eggs, and the adults then go inside the worm and eat them from the inside out. It's really kind of nasty. Here's some more on this one, on this earworm. These are aphid eggs that have been parasitized by a tiny little wasp that eats them from the inside. So you tell that there's a lot of things going on out there in nature it's kind of nature balancing itself out. Insects get pathogenic diseases as well. These guys are covered with all types of fungus. They get diseases like humans do that kills them. I remember when I was working in another county, which would have been probably the early 2000s, there was an invasion of army worms. And like one summer we had army worms crossing the road in massive numbers that were literally making the road slippery because there were so many of them. But they finally got a fungal infection and turned them white like that, and they died off about as fast as they came up. So it's kind of fascinating. So some tricks on natural enemies, buying and releasing things like you can order lady beetles online, and you can order some other beneficials. That usually doesn't work very well just because of a lot of reasons. Some people will say, well, spray water on the plants to attract natural enemies. That's not likely going to work for you either. The best thing to really do is to plant flowers and other plants that attract natural enemies. There's probably some resources here in the library that you can look up, how to attract natural enemies to your gardens. And then use pesticides sparingly and choose the proper insecticides. All right, these two are your probably best bets when it comes to the insect pests. Let the buyer beware of things like Japanese beetle traps. How many of you have used Japanese beetle traps? Yeah. Do they catch thousands and thousands of them? Yes, they do. The problem is, research has shown that they attract many more beetles than they can catch. So the best strategy is to convince your neighbor to put the beetle traps on their property. Okay, if you buy some for them and give them to them for Christmas or something. But don't put them on your own property because you're going to draw in a lot more than you're actually catching. Bug zappers, you can't kill enough bugs that way. How many of you have heard of milky spore? It's a fungal disease, a spore disease that you mix up and you spray in the garden. It's supposed to infect the bad caterpillars and that kind of stuff. It just doesn't seem to work very well. So kind of be leery of that one. Garlic, hot pepper sauce, a lot of these home remedies that people come up with. You got to be careful of those. I get a lot of people will call me and say, hey, I heard if you mix ammonia with this and dish soap and you pour it on your plants, it'll keep the bugs off. I can't recommend any of those home remedy things because it's not using the product the way it's labeled. Okay, so when we use pesticides of any type, whether it's herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, you gotta follow what it says on the label. So if you have any questions about use of an insecticide or use of a fungicide, I always direct people back to the label and say, what does the label say? And there's so many of them out there, I don't know all the labels, so I get real leery of trying to make a recommendation unless I can see the product and look at it and read the label with the homeowner. Real quick, nuisance wildlife, we deal with rabbits. How many of you have rabbits that cause you problems? Yes, okay. So we know there's things that they frequently damage, some things that they don't quite as frequently damage. The only thing to really do with rabbits is to get rid of the habitat that's hiding them. Get away to clear up brush piles, if you've got any trash laying around, old tires, just anything that they might use as a home. Try to clear out tall vegetation. There are repellents that are labeled in Indiana for rabbits, but that doesn't mean that they're all effective. It just means that they're labeled for you to use. It doesn't speak to the effectiveness, it just speaks to the fact that you can use it and probably not poison yourself or the environment. There's some other options here that get a little more lethal as we go down here. If you look at what the law says, my grandmother was the worst violator of game laws that I ever knew. She was always shooting rabbits in her vegetable garden, and I would tell her, Grandma, it's not legal to shoot them. There's a hunting season for rabbits. You can't shoot them outside the hunting season. There are no poisons registered for rabbits, so don't go there. What I generally do is just try to fence them out. And rabbits can be pretty effectively fenced out. Rabbits do a good job of jumping this way, but not this way. So it doesn't take a very tall fence to keep a rabbit out. But what you want to do is get about a 3-foot chicken wire fence and bend over the bottom foot and lay it flat on the ground so they can't tunnel underneath it. And put some rocks or some logs or bricks or something on it to keep it mashed down. And that does a pretty good job. If you have rabbits chewing on your trees and shrubs, building a little cylinder of hardware cloth or wire mesh will help keep them off of that. Deer, this is my hand feeding a deer. It's a whole other story as to how we got that picture. But the idea is that deer are here to stay. They are somewhat selective feeders. But the bottom line is when they're hungry, they're gonna eat about anything. And the example I use with deer is I worked with a lady years ago that her thing was tulips. And she loved her tulips, had tulips lining her driveway, all these different varieties that she got from all over the country. And she lived right across from a big city park in Newcastle where there was deer. And every year the deer would come up, and right when those tulips were about to bud out and flower, just nip, 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 and just ate them all. And she was so frustrated. She said, what can I do? I said, well, I think you're gonna have to pick a new favorite flower. And I was saying it kind of tongue in cheek, but the reality is, there's some things that deer just really like, and trying to grow something like tulips is an example that they just really love.
They love pawpaw.
Pawpaw, yeah.
Killed many of our plants.
They'll eat a lot of things. So the best thing to do is just to try to exclude them. If you're growing a high value crop like an orchard, the orchard people will actually put up deer fence to keep them out. That's about the only way to get rid of them. I did want to, last couple things here, make a note of some resources. Somebody in their wisdom years ago, we used to have all our publications housed online. We still have them housed online, but they came up with this name, the Education Store. I've never really clicked with me. I don't like that name, but that's the name. So if you Google Purdue Extension, the Education Store, you'll come up with this website. Okay, we have thousands of bulletins that are online that are free. Okay, you can download them. If you find something that's a bigger booklet, you don't want to print it at home, call me. I'll print it for you and mail it to you. I encourage you to go online and look at the different types of things we have on there. Here's an example in the lawn and garden section. We've got flowers, houseplants, fruit, household pests, landscaping, lawn and turf, master gardener, trees and ornamentals, vegetables, yard pests, and other lawn and garden. So, and that's just in the lawn and garden section. Then when you click on each one of those, it brings up a whole nother section and more and more and more and more. So there's a ton of stuff that's on there. I'm a little biased, but I always tell people, if you're looking for some information online, type the word extension after whatever it is that you're searching for. If you're searching for tomato varieties, type in tomato varieties, Indiana Extension or Purdue Extension. And that'll pull up extension-related articles and bulletins from around the country, oftentimes. So, lastly, I wanted to point out this plant and pest disease lab. I talked about that a little bit earlier, but that is an incredible resource for homeowners in Indiana to use. I mean, your tax dollars are subsidizing it, so you might as well use it, right? It's only $11, as I said, for a sample. And so they can look at, they'll put things under the microscope, they'll take cultures off of it, try to grow the fungus and grow the bacteria, and really tell you for sure what it is. And then we can make recommendations after we know what it is. It's also, if you've got a weird bug in your backyard, you're dying to know what it is, you can take the bug, send it to the plant lab, they'll tell you what it is. Same thing with weed samples, anything like that, they will identify it for you. That's one of the services they offer, as well as disease diagnosis. So, with that, I've just left a couple minutes for questions, but what questions do you have? I know I went through a lot of stuff really quickly, and if you want to have me back sometime, Beth, we'll talk about
I love it.
proper tree planting, we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. Cool.
Slugs, how to get rid of slugs?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways. There are insecticides for slugs. You actually can sprinkle salt on them, and that will actually kind of dissolve them. But one of the tricks that I've seen is to take like old newspapers and saturate, you get them good and wet, hide them behind the bushes or something out of the way, but put them down in your mulched areas, and they'll grow underneath there and attach underneath that wet newspaper. Then you can just pick it up and throw it away. Same thing with, find an old board, leave the board out there, and they'll get on the bottom side of it, and then you can pick them off. Are they on like your hostas, or what are they causing problems?
We have like a hill behind us, and they come out of the hill, they get on plants.
Yeah.
They just get on the plants.
Yeah. So there are insecticides that are labeled for slugs, but I like trapping them that way and just physically picking them off, or I said use old newspapers that are wet or an old board, and then just collect them when you pick up the board. That way you don't have to use an insecticide. So slugs are not easy though, because they're related to the moisture content. So if you've got good moisture, especially in wooded areas, with a lot of leaf litter and that kind of thing, they just seem to be a more problematic issue in places like that. So, good question.
You mentioned aphids earlier.
Uh-huh.
I think someone had asked me some questions about aphids and how to prevent them, and heard some home remedies of, they might be attracted to yellow colored cup with Vaseline on it to trap them.
Yeah.
Or,
They actually, in fact.
And I think sudsy spray was another one that had come up. So.
Aphids are so small, they're easy to wash off with just a good soapy water spray. The soap kind of helps the water penetrate and wash the leaf off better. So that's one method, is just washing your plants down. The entomologists that were here on Tuesday brought boxes of these sticky cards. And they were like a yellow 3x5 card that was sticky on both sides. And you just peel off this outer protective covering, and exposes the stickiness. Then you put those around the house plants and the vegetable garden, and it serves two purposes. One, it literally catches a lot of the bugs because they're drawn to the yellow color. But two, it serves as a monitoring method to keep track of what you have in the garden, what's coming and going, that kind of thing. So those sticky traps work really well. Anything else? I'll stick around for a few minutes if you've got other questions. If you haven't liked us on Facebook, look up Purdue Extension Wayne County. Like us on Facebook. We put a lot of stuff out, a lot of news articles, upcoming events, programs. on our Facebook page.
Thank you so much, Jonathan,
Sure.
for a wonderful program, and I have a very small sweet treat as a token
Oh,
of thanks for you.
thank
Very
you.
small, thank you.
Yummy.
Jonathan will be back with us on April 29th,
Yep.
talking about container gardens and raised beds. So somebody last week had asked about gardens in small spaces. So raised beds and container gardens in particular are will be a good one to address that. And the Purdue Extension resource that Jonathan left on the table, he was mentioning the education store. Their website is in the rear side, the bottom right of there. Looks like www.edustore.purdue.edu.
That's it.
So that would be it. I'm sure you can Google his recommendation as well. Thank you, Jonathan, for that resource. Next week, we will have a program on starting seeds indoors. That's not yet full, so if you haven't registered and you want to, please do. Speaking of seeds, everyone tonight can pick up a new seed packet as you leave on the table over there, where we also have Morrisson-Reeves Library's gardening resources, just some of them. You can also peruse upstairs. The section 635 in the nonfiction upstairs is the place where I found most of those resources, and a couple of movies as well. And then for finishing your evaluation, you'll get a small chocolate treat on your way out. So thank you all very much for participating this evening. And again, thank you, Jonathan, for your
You bet.
expertise.
Yeah, we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Yes.